The heavy leather wallet lay abandoned on the damp edge of a Seattle sidewalk, blending into the gloomy afternoon as if the gray skies had purposely concealed it. Mary Barnes almost walked right past it, her mind completely consumed by a storm of endless worries about how she would manage to pay the upcoming rent and afford her mother's expensive medications. She had been wandering the bustling city streets for hours, exhausted and soaked, when a faint glint of a silver zipper caught her attention through the relentless drizzle. Stopping in her tracks, she glanced around the crowded avenue, but no one seemed to be searching for a lost item, everyone merely rushing to escape the downpour. She knelt down slowly, her fingers brushing against the fine, smooth leather that felt entirely too luxurious for someone in her desperate financial situation. Cradling it in both of her hands, as though it were made of fragile glass, she hurried beneath the metal awning of a closed coffee shop to inspect the contents, shielding her discovery from the freezing rain. Inside the elegant fold, she discovered a pristine identification card bearing the name Richard Zane, the chief executive officer of a massive corporate empire she had only heard about on the evening news broadcasts, Zane Corporate Horizons. Tucked carefully behind the identification were several premium credit cards, important-looking business documents, and a thick stack of $100 bills. It was an astonishing amount of money, far too much for a woman who did not even have enough loose change to buy groceries for the remainder of the week. Mary felt her frozen hands begin to tremble violently against the cold air. Did she desperately need that cash? Absolutely. She could instantly clear all her outstanding debts, purchase fresh and nutritious food, and finally send a substantial amount to her ailing mother. Any ordinary person drowning in her specific circumstances would have hesitated, but she snapped the expensive wallet shut without a second thought. She whispered into the cold wind that she could never do such a thing, knowing exactly what her conscience demanded, even as her harsh reality pushed her toward a terrifying financial abyss. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she tucked the damp leather securely inside the inner pocket of her worn jacket and began the long trek toward the towering corporate headquarters listed on the identification card. By the time she pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, she felt entirely out of place in the vast, gleaming lobby, where every surface seemed to reflect wealth and power. Men and women moved with fierce determination, clad in perfectly tailored suits, their footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floors with unwavering confidence. Soaked to the bone and shivering in her faded, inexpensive clothing, Mary felt completely invisible, or worse, like an unwanted stain on their immaculate corporate canvas. She slowly approached the grand front desk, where two impeccably groomed receptionists paused their typing to examine her thoroughly from head to toe. One of the women, adjusting her headset, asked if they could help her, using a tone that was technically polite, but unmistakably laced with icy judgment. Pulling the object from her jacket, Mary explained that she had found the wallet and noted it belonged to Richard Zane, stating simply that she only wished to return it to its rightful owner. The two receptionists exchanged a swift, knowing glance, initially expressing mild shock before their expressions morphed into something closely resembling deep suspicion. One of the women extended a manicured hand across the marble counter to confiscate the item, but Mary pulled it back slightly, expressing her strong preference to deliver it directly to the owner if at all possible. The receptionists seemed to suppress amused smirks, fully aware of how absurd a demand this was from a disheveled stranger, until one finally picked up a secure telephone line. After murmuring in hushed tones for several long seconds, the receptionist looked up with genuine astonishment, informing Mary that Mr. Zane would actually receive her and instructing her to take the private elevator to the uppermost floor. Mary felt a sudden, sickening drop in her stomach, watching the digital floor numbers climb endlessly higher, entirely convinced she was making a massive fool of herself. When the polished steel doors finally parted, she stepped into an astonishingly immaculate reception area where a stern, imposing woman named Laura Moore stood waiting with her hands neatly folded. Laura instructed Mary to follow her, her voice completely devoid of any decipherable emotion, leading the way down a wide, intimidatingly silent corridor lined with abstract art. They arrived at a set of heavy mahogany doors that glided open automatically, revealing an expansive corner office where Richard Zane sat behind a massive glass desk, intensely focused on a glowing tablet. The moment he lifted his gaze, Mary felt as though his sharp, calculating eyes were piercing straight through her tired exterior, attempting to read the very depths of her soul. Standing up slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored vest, he acknowledged that she was the one who had located his missing property. Mary nodded nervously, assuring him that absolutely nothing was missing, and reiterating that her only intention was to ensure it was safely returned to him. Richard retrieved the wallet, quickly thumbing through the contents before allowing a tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of genuine surprise to soften his intense features. He stated quietly that very few people walking the streets of Seattle would have returned such a significant sum of cash, demanding to know exactly why she had chosen to do so. Shrugging her damp shoulders, Mary replied honestly that she returned it simply because it did not belong to her, a truth she considered entirely uncomplicated. He slowly paced around the edge of his enormous desk, studying her threadbare coat and exhausted posture, noting aloud that such integrity was incredibly rare, especially for someone clearly enduring severe hardships. Mary felt a flush of defensive heat rise to her cheeks, firmly stating that her personal struggles were irrelevant and that she sought no reward for merely doing the right thing. Richard observed her with profound intensity, before gesturing silently to Laura, instructing her to immediately cancel every single appointment he had scheduled for the next 60 minutes, leaving Mary entirely bewildered. Laura exited the grand office without uttering a single word of protest, leaving Mary standing awkwardly in the oppressive silence of the executive suite. Richard pointed toward a luxurious leather chair opposite his desk, instructing her to sit down and directly asking her how she currently made a living. Mary sank into the soft cushions, admitting with a heavy sigh that she was currently unemployed and had spent the last several weeks frantically searching for any available position. His expression shifted slightly, displaying a complicated mixture of deep interest and something far more melancholic, as he leaned his elbows against the cool glass surface. He asked if she realized that the modern corporate world rarely rewarded blind honesty, a statement that hung heavy in the air between them. Mary replied that while she suspected the world was indeed unfair, her personal conscience simply would not allow her to steal, regardless of how desperate her circumstances had become. A fleeting, ghostly smile touched Richard's lips. Vanishing so quickly, Mary thought she might have imagined the rare display of warmth from the imposing executive. Without any preamble, he stated that he desperately needed someone with her exact moral compass working within his massive organization, offering her a position as his personal assistant on the spot. Mary froze completely, her mind racing to comprehend the offer, pointing out the obvious fact that she lacked any formal education, corporate experience, or professional references. Richard waved his hand dismissively, interrupting her protests to declare that she possessed the one singular trait he valued above all conventional qualifications, which was unbreakable integrity. Feeling a cold knot form in her chest, Mary expressed her utter confusion as to why a powerful billionaire would blindly trust a drenched stranger he had met mere minutes ago. Taking a very deep, calculated breath, Richard confessed calmly that the wallet had not been lost by accident, dropping a revelation that made the room spin. He stepped closer to where she sat, maintaining steady eye contact, as he explained that dropping the wallet on that specific street corner had been a deliberate, calculated test of human nature. Mary stared at him, her eyes widening in pure shock as she repeated the word test, struggling to process the sheer audacity of the man standing before her. He confirmed her suspicion, revealing he had planted it there many times before, and she was the absolute first and only individual to return it with every single dollar accounted for. The initial shock inside Mary quickly boiled over into a fierce, protective anger, her hands balling into tight fists as she stood up abruptly from the comfortable chair. She angrily demanded to know if he found it amusing to play twisted psychological games with desperate people who might actually need that money just to survive the freezing winter. Richard seemed genuinely taken aback by her fiery outrage, observing her with a newfound, profound respect, as she firmly declared she refused to be used as a pawn in his cynical social experiments. Breathing heavily, Mary gathered her damp jacket and firmly rejected his generous job offer, turning her back on the most powerful man in Seattle to march toward the exit. Before her hand could even touch the heavy door handle, Richard called out her name, his voice suddenly stripped of all its corporate authority, sounding unexpectedly vulnerable. He pleaded with her to understand that his intentions were not malicious, confessing that a series of profound betrayals had entirely destroyed his ability to trust anyone in his life. He admitted quietly that her selfless actions that afternoon had finally proven to him that genuine goodness still existed in a world he had long considered hopelessly corrupt. Mary remained silent, her hand hovering over the door, entirely overwhelmed by the massive influx of conflicting emotions and the startling vulnerability of this enigmatic billionaire. Richard gently suggested she take time to carefully consider the offer without any immediate pressure, allowing her to finally escape into the bustling hallway with her heart hammering relentlessly against her ribs. By the time Mary returned to the chaotic, rain-swept streets of the city, her mind was an absolute whirlwind of confusion, anger, and undeniable temptation. She simply could not fathom why a man of such immense wealth and power would resort to leaving traps on the sidewalk, nor why he was so stubbornly insistent on hiring her. Just as she approached a bus stop, her inexpensive cellular phone buzzed loudly, displaying a text message from her ailing mother asking if she had found any luck securing a steady income. Staring at the glowing screen, Mary felt an overwhelming wave of guilt wash over her, knowing she had just walked away from a life-changing salary simply out of righteous pride. She replied with a gentle lie, assuring her mother that she was still actively hunting and that she loved her dearly, before stuffing the device back into her damp pocket. That night, tossing and turning in her cramped, drafty apartment, she realized that maintaining her fierce pride would not pay for the expensive medications her mother so desperately required to survive. The following morning, after enduring a completely humiliating and unsuccessful interview for a waitress position at a crowded downtown diner, Mary sat dejectedly on a cold park bench. Her phone suddenly rang, displaying an unknown private number, and upon answering, she heard the crisp, unmistakably professional voice of Laura Moore, inquiring if she had reached a final decision. Swallowing her lingering pride, Mary politely requested to speak directly with Mr. Zane, and moments later, Richard's calm, steady voice filled her ear, patiently waiting for her response. She admitted softly that while she still strongly disapproved of his manipulative testing methods, she could no longer afford to let her personal pride dictate her family's financial survival. Richard expressed his genuine satisfaction without a hint of arrogance, officially welcoming her to the company and instructing her to arrive promptly at 8 o'clock the following morning. Hanging up the phone, Mary stared up at the towering skyscrapers of the city, absolutely terrified but acutely aware that her ordinary life had just changed forever. Promptly at 8 o'clock the next morning, Mary stepped into the grand lobby of Zane Corporate Horizons, wearing the most professional, albeit slightly worn, outfit she could piece together. Laura was already waiting by the security turnstiles, holding a sleek orientation folder and greeting Mary with the exact same stoic, unreadable expression she had worn the previous day. As they navigated the labyrinth of polished corridors, Mary acutely felt the heavy weight of dozens of curious, scrutinizing stares from various employees wondering who this unknown woman was. Laura escorted her to a surprisingly spacious desk, situated directly adjacent to the chief executive's private suite, officially designating it as Mary's new professional domain within the sprawling company. Mary gently traced her fingers across the pristine, empty surface of the desk, finding it incredibly difficult to believe that this luxurious corporate space now belonged entirely to her. After finalizing a mountain of dense, complicated employment paperwork, Laura instructed her to knock on Richard's door, as he specifically wished to speak with her before the chaotic day officially commenced. Entering the spacious office, Mary found Richard deeply engrossed in a thick stack of legal documents, a slight, concentrated frown creasing his forehead as he worked. He gestured for her to approach, asking casually if she felt ready to tackle the overwhelming challenges that awaited her in this fast-paced, high-stakes corporate environment. She replied sincerely that she would give the position her absolute best effort, to which he responded that he never expected perfection, only the unwavering honesty she had already perfectly demonstrated. He outlined her initial manageable duties, which included organizing his chaotic daily schedule, filtering out unnecessary electronic correspondence, and managing his incredibly active private telephone lines. Richard paused, offering a rare, reassuring look, advising her not to feel intimidated by the wealthy, powerful individuals she would soon encounter, because most of them merely wore carefully constructed masks. Leaving his office with a strange, comforting warmth spreading through her chest, Mary realized that despite his immense wealth, Richard was perhaps the most genuine person in the entire building. As the frantic hours of the morning melted away, Mary slowly but surely adapted to the relentless, demanding rhythm of her new responsibilities, meticulously organizing files and routing important calls. Laura supervised her progress with strict, unyielding standards, yet she never once raised her voice or treated Mary with the condescension she had feared from such a high-ranking executive assistant. Just as Mary was preparing to organize her desk for the lunch hour, a shadow fell across her workspace, belonging to a sharply dressed employee whose name tag read Kevin. Leaning casually against the partition, Kevin offered a sickly sweet smile, noting with thick sarcasm that she must possess some incredibly unique talents to bypass everyone else and land on the executive floor. Mary maintained her composure, politely stating that she simply intended to work hard, but Kevin laughed dismissively, loudly mocking the famous story of the returned wallet as highly suspicious and unbelievably convenient. His dark, invasive gaze lingered on her for a moment too long before he sauntered away, leaving Mary with a creeping, icy sensation of impending trouble crawling up her spine. Determined not to let Kevin's venomous insinuations ruin her afternoon, Mary focused entirely on a large stack of complex financial summaries Laura had tasked her with sorting by date. Later that afternoon, Richard emerged from his office, interrupting her concentration by asking her to grab her coat and accompany him to a highly confidential off-site meeting. They rode in absolute silence in the back of his luxurious town car, traveling far beyond the bustling city center toward the quiet, wealthy suburbs, where sprawling estates hid behind tall gates. Breaking the silence, Mary cautiously asked him why he felt the constant, overwhelming need to test the basic morality of strangers with the dropped wallet experiment. Looking out the tinted window at the passing trees, Richard admitted quietly that after suffering a series of devastating personal betrayals from those he loved most, he needed proof that goodness survived. He turned to look directly at her, his eyes softening significantly, stating that since the moment she returned his belongings, he had finally begun to entertain the terrifying possibility of trusting again. The off-site meeting took place in a sterile, brightly lit conference room at a prominent medical research facility, focusing entirely on the complex funding for experimental disease treatments. Mary sat quietly in the corner, furiously taking mental notes as Richard commanded the room, his tone authoritative yet deeply compassionate when discussing the desperate patients awaiting these crucial medical breakthroughs. Returning to the corporate tower as the sun began to dip below the skyline, they found Laura waiting anxiously near the elevators, clutching a freshly printed evening newspaper with white-knuckled intensity. She handed the paper directly to Richard, pointing to a scathing, prominent headline accusing the Zane Medical Foundation of grossly mismanaging charitable funds and engaging in severe financial corruption. As Richard's jaw tightened in visible anger, Laura hesitantly pointed out a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page, quietly noting that the vicious article also explicitly mentioned Mary. Mary felt the blood drain completely from her face as she read the hateful words, which falsely claimed Richard had recently hired an uneducated, inexperienced assistant to deliberately obscure his fraudulent activities. Panic tightened her throat as she immediately apologized, fearing her mere presence had somehow triggered this massive public relations disaster for the man who had just saved her family. Richard slammed the newspaper down onto a nearby table, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective register as he firmly ordered her never to apologize for the malicious lies of cowards. He promised to unleash his legal team and completely destroy the publication, demanding that Mary hold her head high and completely ignore the toxic whispers that would inevitably circulate the office. Gathering her belongings to leave for the night, she spotted Kevin lurking near the elevators, wearing a smug, triumphant smirk that confirmed her deepest fears that the nightmare was only just beginning. The atmosphere on the executive floor the following morning was incredibly thick with unspoken tension, every passing employee seeming to throw lingering, suspicious glances in Mary's direction. She could feel the heavy weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her shoulders, completely aware that the defamatory article had already been circulated to every computer in the building. Laura intercepted her before she could even turn on her computer monitor, her usually neutral expression replaced by a tight, severe frown, as she instructed Mary to enter Richard's office immediately. Walking across the plush carpet felt akin to marching toward an execution, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she mentally prepared herself to be swiftly and unceremoniously fired. Richard stood facing the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, turning slowly to face her with a surprisingly calm, reassuring demeanor that caught her off guard. Before she could utter a single word of apology, he raised a hand to silence her, emphatically stating that he had already deployed a team of ruthless lawyers to force a public retraction. He completely refused to allow her to shoulder any blame for the coordinated smear campaign, insisting that she was merely collateral damage in an ongoing vicious war against his philanthropic efforts. Stepping closer, he looked down at her with intense sincerity, assuring her that her position was absolutely secure and that no amount of corporate sabotage would ever make him doubt her character. The profound relief that washed over Mary was almost physically staggering, allowing her to finally take a deep, steadying breath and sincerely thank him for his unwavering, irrational faith in her. Richard then gestured toward a concealed door she had never noticed before, inviting her into a small, private projection room, hidden deep within the walls of his sprawling executive suite. The room was dark and intimate, dominated by a large screen where Richard silently queued up a highly encrypted digital video file, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he typed the password. The screen flickered to life, revealing a stunning, vibrant woman with bright blonde hair and incredibly warm, laughing eyes, sitting comfortably on a sunlit porch while speaking directly into the camera. Richard's voice cracked with deep, raw emotion as he quietly introduced the woman on the screen as Victoria, his late wife, explaining that this specific message was recorded mere weeks before she passed. On the video, Victoria spoke with heartbreaking tenderness, begging Richard not to let her impending death permanently harden his heart, urging him to remain open to trusting new people in the future. Watching the powerful CEO discreetly wipe a rogue tear from his cheek, Mary felt an overwhelming surge of pure empathy, completely understanding the immense, crushing grief that drove his eccentric behavior. He paused the video, plunging the small room back into silence, confessing that for several dark years he had completely ignored Victoria's dying wish, choosing instead to isolate himself behind walls of suspicion. He turned to face Mary in the dim light, stating that her fierce refusal to accept his money when she was desperately poor had finally shattered the thick armor he had built around himself. Mary was completely speechless, deeply moved by the incredible vulnerability this powerful man was displaying, realizing that their chance encounter on the rainy sidewalk had somehow saved them both from different kinds of ruin. Later that afternoon, returning to the chaotic reality of her desk, Laura handed her a thick travel itinerary, casually dropping the bombshell that she was expected to accompany Richard to Boston the following morning. It was a massive, highly publicized medical summit for the Foundation, and Mary felt a sudden, terrifying spike of anxiety, knowing the hostile press and skeptical board members would be watching her every move. Just as Mary was packing her briefcase to leave for the evening, an incredibly elegant, sharp-featured woman wearing a designer coat stepped off the private executive elevator, walking directly toward her desk. The woman introduced herself with a chilling, predatory smile as Danielle Richards, a name Mary instantly recognized from office gossip as Richards' notoriously bitter, highly influential former fiancé. Danielle leaned over the desk, her expensive perfume suffocating the air, and venomously mocked Mary for being the latest pathetic, uneducated charity project Richard was using to heal his fractured ego. Without missing a beat, Danielle smoothly retrieved a sleek black checkbook from her designer handbag, casually offering to write a massive sum if Mary agreed to resign immediately and vanish from Seattle forever. Disgust flared hot and bright in Mary's chest. She stood up straight, matching the woman's icy glare, and firmly rejected the bribe, stating that her loyalty could not be bought for any price. Danielle's predatory smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated malice as she leaned in dangerously close, whispering a dark promise that Mary would deeply regret her foolish arrogance. She turned sharply on her expensive heels and glided back onto the elevator, leaving Mary alone in the quiet office, with a rapidly beating heart and a profound sense of impending doom. The flight to Boston early the next morning was tense, though Richard seemed blissfully unaware of the previous night's confrontation, spending the entire journey reviewing complex medical data and coaching Mary on event protocols. Upon arriving at the lavish Boston Convention Center, Mary armed herself with a professional camera, determined to fade into the background and meticulously document the philanthropic summit, as Richard had explicitly requested. However, just as Richard took the grand stage to deliver his keynote address to hundreds of prestigious doctors, the massive crystal chandeliers above them flickered violently before plunging the entire auditorium into total darkness. The immediate aftermath of the sudden blackout was utter chaos, filled with the panicked sounds of hundreds of prestigious guests shouting in the pitch-black auditorium, entirely unsure if it was a targeted attack. Mary remained perfectly still, clutching the expensive camera tightly against her chest, feeling the terrifying rush of adrenaline pumping furiously through her veins as security personnel frantically barked orders through their crackling radios. It felt like an eternity before the harsh emergency lights finally flickered to life, casting an eerie, yellowish glow across the confused crowd and revealing Richard standing calmly, yet furiously, on the main stage. Laura materialized out of the chaotic crowd, rushing to Richard's side to deliver the grim news that the building's main electrical panel had been deliberately and forcefully destroyed by an unknown assailant. As the whispers began to spread rapidly among the wealthy attendees, Mary distinctly heard several cruel voices nearby, loudly suggesting that the suspicious new assistant was likely responsible for the catastrophic sabotage. Richard immediately descended the stage, cutting through the whispering crowd with a dangerously dark expression, walking straight toward Mary, and loudly demanding that everyone step away from his personal staff. He placed a firm, protective hand on her trembling shoulder, projecting his authoritative voice so the entire room could hear him declare that the blackout was a cowardly act of professional sabotage. Despite his staunch, unwavering public defense, the joyous, philanthropic spirit of the massive event was completely ruined, prompting many wealthy donors and influential doctors to cautiously retreat toward the exit doors. Riding in the back of the town car toward their luxury hotel, Mary stared out at the historic streets of Boston, feeling the crushing, unbearable weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. She softly whispered that she had somehow ruined everything, but Richard immediately shot down her self-pity, fiercely reiterating that the cowardly attack had absolutely nothing to do with her presence. Later that evening, while Mary sat alone in her lavish hotel room attempting to process the disastrous day, a sharp, authoritative knock at the heavy wooden door startled her out of her thoughts. Laura stood in the hallway, holding a thick stack of preliminary security reports, her face grim as she confirmed that the electrical cables had been expertly severed using highly specialized, heavy-duty equipment. Mary hesitantly asked if Laura truly believed someone from Richard's complicated past was orchestrating this nightmare, seeking some kind of logical explanation for the seemingly endless string of targeted, malicious attacks against them. Evaluating Mary with a long, unreadable stare, Laura finally admitted that anything was possible when dealing with immense wealth and power, advising the young woman to lock her door and try to rest. Mary lay awake for hours, staring blindly at the dark ceiling, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the situation, realizing she was caught in the crossfire of a deeply dangerous corporate war. The following morning, desperately needing coffee before facing another tense day at the convention center, Mary ventured down into the bustling hotel lobby, keeping her head low to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. Just as she poured a cup from the silver urn, an agonizingly familiar, honey-sweet voice sliced through the morning chatter, and she turned to find Danielle Richards standing far too close. Danielle offered a brilliant, completely fake smile, casually mentioning what a horrific tragedy the previous night's blackout had been, her eyes dancing with a wicked, undisguised amusement that made Mary's blood run cold. Gripping her porcelain cup tightly, Mary narrowed her eyes, bluntly asking if the wealthy socialite had orchestrated the dangerous stunt just to embarrass Richard in front of his most vital, influential philanthropic peers. Danielle laughed, a cruel, ringing sound, leaning in to whisper that Richard despised failure above all things, and that Mary's continued proximity to such massive disasters would inevitably lead to her rapid dismissal. Mary ground her teeth together, fiercely retorting that she was entirely confident in her employer's judgment. But Danielle merely rolled her eyes, advising the younger woman to accept the buyout before she was publicly destroyed. Danielle vanished into the bustling breakfast crowd, leaving Mary clutching her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white, feeling completely isolated in a world she simply did not understand. The remainder of the summit was a grueling marathon of tense smiles and paranoid glances. Everywhere Mary walked with her camera, she felt the heavy, accusatory stares of executives who believed the nasty rumors. Richard checked on her frequently, his voice a steady, calming anchor amidst the swirling chaos, quietly assuring her that a private investigative team was currently dissecting the security footage from the electrical room. By the time they boarded the private jet back to Seattle, Mary felt completely drained, exhausted by the constant vigilance required to simply exist within Richard's complicated high-stakes orbit. Returning to the familiar glass tower in Seattle the next morning brought absolutely no relief. Instead, it felt as though she were walking straight into a perfectly laid trap, waiting to snap shut. No sooner had Mary set her bag down on her desk than Kevin, the snide employee who had tormented her since her first day, swaggered over with a triumphant, deeply unpleasant smirk. Without a single word of greeting, he slapped a manila folder onto her pristine desk, slowly opening it to reveal a glossy, high-resolution photograph of Mary entering the Boston hotel late at night. Printed boldly beneath the entirely innocent image was a threatening, anonymous caption, claiming she was a dangerous corporate spy, and Kevin gleefully announced his immediate intention to deliver this evidence directly to the CEO. A freezing wave of pure, unfiltered panic washed over Mary, realizing that whoever was actively trying to destroy Richard was simultaneously attempting to frame her for the entire, elaborate conspiracy. Refusing to let the malicious, grinning man intimidate her any further, Mary slammed her hands down onto the desk, her eyes blazing with a fierce, sudden defiance that clearly took Kevin completely by surprise. If he truly intended to march into the executive office and present those fabricated, ridiculous accusations to their boss, she fiercely demanded that she accompany him to witness the inevitable confrontation firsthand. Kevin scoffed loudly, attempting to mask his sudden hesitation with a layer of thick bravado, loudly proclaiming that he was merely doing his civic duty to protect the prestigious company from outside threats. The long, agonizing walk down the quiet executive hallway felt like a march to the gallows, Mary's heart hammering furiously against her ribs, while Kevin clutched the manila folder like a prized, victorious trophy. Laura looked up from her computer monitor as they approached the heavy mahogany doors, her sharp eyes darting between Kevin's smug expression and Mary's pale, determined face, sensing the explosive tension instantly. Ignoring Laura's questioning glare, Kevin pushed the doors open, marching directly toward Richard's massive glass desk, and dramatically throwing the printed photograph down in front of the highly occupied chief executive officer. Kevin began to ramble aggressively, regurgitating the vicious rumors about Mary's lack of background and linking her to the disastrous blackout in Boston, claiming this anonymous photograph was the definitive smoking gun evidence. Richard stared silently at the photograph for several long, agonizing seconds before slowly raising his intense, dark eyes to meet Kevin's, his expression so completely devoid of emotion that the room felt instantly freezing. Speaking in a low, dangerously calm voice that commanded absolute silence, Richard stated that he possessed the ability to recognize true integrity, and the young woman standing before him possessed more than anyone else. He stood up slowly, towering over the suddenly terrified employee, and delivered a devastating final ultimatum. If Kevin ever harassed, followed, or baselessly accused his assistant again, his corporate career would be permanently terminated. Kevin practically sprinted out of the office, his face entirely drained of color, leaving a profound, vibrating silence in his wake as the heavy wooden doors clicked firmly shut behind his retreating form. Mary released a long, trembling breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees suddenly feeling incredibly weak as the overwhelming stress of the past few days finally caught up to her exhausted body. Richard walked around the edge of his desk, his harsh, authoritative demeanor instantly softening into something remarkably gentle as he poured a glass of cool water and handed it to her shaking hands. He urged her to sit down, apologizing deeply for the terrible ordeal she had endured, before dropping a revelation that made her exhausted mind snap immediately back into razor-sharp focus. The private security team had successfully recovered a crystal-clear image from a hidden camera near the Boston electrical panel, and the saboteur had used an access card registered directly to Danielle Richards. Mary sat frozen in the plush leather chair, the puzzle pieces rapidly snapping into place. Danielle's sudden appearance in Boston, the cruel mocking in the lobby, and the generous buyout offer all made perfect sense. The bitter, wealthy socialite was entirely willing to destroy millions of dollars in philanthropic funding simply to maintain a twisted sense of control over Richard's life, and punish anyone who dared to get close. Richard knelt down slightly to meet her eye level, his gaze incredibly intense and filled with a profound, undeniable gratitude that made Mary's chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. He confessed quietly that before she picked up his wallet on that rainy sidewalk, he had been drowning in a sea of toxic paranoia, utterly convinced that every single person in the world was corrupt. Her unwavering honesty, her fierce refusal to be bought by Danielle, and her bravery in facing her accuser head-on had finally restored his broken faith in humanity, completely changing his life. Tears prickled at the corners of Mary's eyes, not from sadness or fear, but from the incredible realization that she had finally found a place where she belonged, respected and deeply valued. As she looked at Richard, the formidable CEO who had transformed from a cynical tester of souls into a fiercely protective ally, the ultimate truth of their unexpected journey became brilliantly clear. Life often places incredible burdens upon our shoulders, pushing us to the very edge of desperation, where compromising our deep, personal values seems like the only possible way to survive the crushing storm. Yet, it is precisely in those darkest, most challenging moments that our true character is forged, because maintaining our integrity when nobody is watching is the most powerful legacy we can possibly build. Trust is an incredibly fragile thing, easily shattered by betrayal and cruelty, but when it is freely given to someone who truly deserves it, it has the miraculous power to heal the deepest wounds. We often believe that wealth and status are the ultimate shields against suffering, but genuine human connection, built entirely on a foundation of unshakable honesty, is the only treasure that truly matters. Mary never could have imagined that picking up a lost item would lead her through a terrifying maze of corporate sabotage, bitter jealousy, and intense scrutiny, but she would never change a single step. Through her courage, a broken man learned to open his heart again, and a struggling woman discovered her own immense, undeniable strength, proving that light can always find a way to pierce the darkness. Walking out of the grand corporate tower that evening, the Seattle skies were finally clear, and Mary breathed in the crisp, cool air, ready to face whatever beautiful, complicated future awaited them both.